My heart stops when Karen pulls the gun from her purse, pointing it directly at my chest. For a horrifying moment, I'm just a man staring down the barrel of a weapon, my hands shaking as I grip my phone. "This cabin will never belong to you," she says with chilling confidence. "One way or another, your family's legacy ends today." She laughs and mocks me, but something changes inside me. My grip steadies, my breathing slows. "You're standing on Sullivan land, Karen. We've held it through world wars and depressions. You think you're the first bully we've faced." The truth is, while she was sending harassment letters and manipulating local officials, I was quietly working on something that would change everything between us. Something she never saw coming because she was too busy underestimating the simple cabin owner she thought I was. Have you ever been in a situation where someone completely misjudged who they were dealing with? Drop a comment below with your story. Some people only learn the hard way that appearances can be deceiving, and Karen's expensive education is just beginning. 8 months ago, I never would have imagined myself in a standoff with a power-hungry HOA president brandishing a firearm on my own property. Back then, I was just trying to figure out how to keep my family's legacy alive. My name is David Sullivan, and until recently, I was a financial analyst working remotely for an investment firm in Denver. That changed when my grandmother died, leaving me Pine Ridge Cabin, 40 acres of Colorado mountain land that had been in my family for 4 generations. I packed up my apartment, said goodbye to city life, and moved back to the place where I spent every summer as a kid. The cabin wasn't just a building, it was where my great-grandfather had settled after coming back from World War I, where my grandfather had taught me to fish, where my grandmother had told me stories about our family's history. The problem was, I knew more about stock portfolios than mountain living. Thankfully, I had help. Tom Bradley, our 58-year-old property caretaker, had worked for my family for over 20 years and knew every inch of Pine Ridge. He treated me like the grandson he never had, especially after my grandmother passed. "This land has Sullivan blood mixed in with the soil," he told me my first day back. "Your great-grandfather built something that lasted, and now it's your turn to carry it forward." My neighbor Sarah Mitchell was another blessing. A 45-year-old single mom with a teenage daughter, she ran a small horse ranch adjacent to my property and knew everything about mountain life. She started dropping by with casseroles and practical advice, both equally valuable to a bachelor who could barely work a wood stove and had no idea how to maintain the well pump. Life was starting to find a rhythm when I first met Karen Pemberton. It was a Thursday morning and I was splitting firewood with Tom when a pristine white Range Rover pulled up my gravel driveway, kicking up dust that seemed to personally offend its existence. Out stepped a woman in her early 50s, wearing cream-colored slacks and a designer jacket that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her platinum blonde hair was cut in that specific, "I want to speak to the manager" style, and the oversized sunglasses she wore couldn't hide the look of disgust as she surveyed my property. "Are you the owner?" she asked, not bothering with a greeting. When I confirmed, she introduced herself as Karen Pemberton, president of the Mountain View Estates Homeowners Association. I had heard about Mountain View, a luxury development that had sprung up about a quarter-mile from the edge of my property in the last 5 years. "We've received numerous complaints about the rustic appearance of your property," she said, waving a manicured hand toward my cabin. "It's affecting our residents' quality of life and property values. We need you to address it immediately." I tried explaining that my cabin had been here long before their manicured lawns and community tennis court. I also pointed out that my property wasn't part of their HOA, so their regulations didn't apply to me. Karen's face tightened like she tasted something sour. "Mr. Sullivan, we have ways of dealing with uncooperative neighbors. I strongly suggest you find a solution." As she turned to leave, she paused. "And you might want to paint that cabin. That faded blue is an eyesore visible from the Mountain View entrance." After she left, Tom chuckled. "The Pemberton woman again. Her husband Richard is that real estate mogul who's been buying up all the mountain land around here. They've been trying to get your grandmother to sell for years." A week later, I found an official-looking envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a letter from the Mountain View Estates HOA, citing violations for excessive vegetation height, my natural wildflower meadow, unapproved structures, apparently referring to my historic log cabin, and unauthorized recreational activities. Tom had been teaching some local kids to fish in our pond. Along with the demands came $3,000 in fines. I nearly choked on my coffee. The letter also hinted that continued non-compliance would result in escalating enforcement actions. I called my college buddy Marcus Rodriguez, who had become a real estate attorney, and sent him photos of the letter. His response came quickly: "They have no jurisdiction over your property, David. This is harassment, plain and simple." But be careful, Karen's husband Richard Pemberton has deep pockets and connections with local officials. This isn't their first rodeo. Marcus suggested I research any development plans in the area. That night, I dug through county records online and found something disturbing. Pemberton Development Group had filed permits for a project called Mountain View Grand, a luxury resort and residential complex. The proposed development wrapped around my property on 3 sides. They weren't just targeting me because of some aesthetic concerns. They wanted my land and they were trying to bully me into selling cheap. The realization made my blood boil. This wasn't just about an entitled woman with too much power. This was a calculated attack on my family's legacy. I decided then that I wouldn't just defend my land, I would stand my ground against whatever they threw at me. Little did I know how ugly things would get, or that in 8 months I'd be holding the deed to Karen Pemberton's own house. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The real battle was just beginning, and before it was over, I'd learn exactly what people are capable of when money, power, and land are at stake. The harassment started small but escalated quickly. Every day brought a new letter from the HOA, each with more ridiculous violations than the last. One cited the non-regulation color of my cabin, the same blue stain that had been on the property since the 1950s. Another complained about my dog barking too early and disturbing the peace. I started keeping a file of every communication on Marcus's advice. Document everything, he said. If this goes to court, you'll need proof of their pattern of behavior. But letters were just the beginning. I began noticing unfamiliar vehicles parked along my property line, taking photos. When I approached them, they claimed to be from county compliance, but sped off before I could verify their credentials. One morning, I discovered someone had cut my fence during the night, allowing deer to get into Sarah's vegetable garden. Thankfully, Sarah spotted the damage early and helped me repair it before her horses could wander onto the mountain road. This wasn't an accident, she told me as we strung new wire. Someone's trying to cause problems for you. Sarah's expression grew serious. They did the same thing to me 3 years ago. Karen kept sending me notices about violations, saying my horse ranch was lowering their property values. I couldn't fight them, not as a single mom with a teenager and a business to run. I sold them 5 acres of my north pasture just to get them off my back. Her admission surprised me. Sarah had always seemed so strong and self-sufficient. You should know what you're up against, David. Karen is just the public face. Her husband Richard is the real power. He's been systematically buying up all the mountain land around here for his new development. Your cabin is the biggest obstacle in their way. That evening, I received a call from Marcus with more concerning news. He discovered that County Commissioner Janet Walsh had recently approved a public easement through part of my property without notifying me. The proposed access trail would cut right through my favorite fishing spot and effectively open my private land to public use. This is textbook, David, Marcus explained. They're trying to devalue your property before making an offer. Once that trail goes in, your privacy is gone and your land value drops. Then they swoop in with a lowball offer that seems like your only way out. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. How can the commissioner approve something like that without my knowledge? Don't I have property rights? Marcus sighed. You do, but Commissioner Walsh and Richard Pemberton are old friends. The approval was buried in a routine parks and recreation vote at the last county meeting. We can contest it, but it'll take time and money. As I hung up, my phone immediately rang again, an unknown number. When I answered, a gruff voice said, "You should take the hint and sell the cabin while you still can. Things can get dangerous for stubborn people." The line went dead before I could respond. I stood there, phone in hand, shock giving way to anger. They were escalating from harassment to threats. I immediately called the county sheriff's office to report the call, but without caller ID information, there wasn't much they could do. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the old cabin, every distant sound had me reaching for the baseball bat I'd placed beside my bed. This wasn't just about land anymore, it felt personal and potentially dangerous. The next morning I made a decision. Instead of just playing defense, it was time to go public. The monthly county commissioner meeting was scheduled for the following evening, and citizens were allowed 3 minutes each during the public comment period. I spent the day preparing my statement, gathering documentation of the harassment, and making copies of the development plans I'd found. Sarah offered to come for moral support, and Tom insisted on attending too, saying, "Those county folks need to see that you've got people behind you." When we arrived at the county building, I was surprised to see the parking lot nearly full. Usually, these meetings drew only a handful of concerned citizens, but tonight every seat in the chamber was occupied. Karen and Richard Pemberton sat in the front row, along with several people wearing Mountain View Estates polo shirts. Commissioner Walsh looked uncomfortable when she spotted me walking in with my small group. During the standard business portion of the meeting, I noticed how many agenda items seemed to benefit Pemberton Development Group. Easements granted, zoning changes approved, tax incentives offered. It was clear that Richard had significant influence over local governance. When the public comment period finally began, I walked to the podium, hands shaking slightly as I placed my notes before me. I introduced myself and explained that I was the current owner of Pine Ridge Cabin, a property that had been in my family for 4 generations. I described the harassment from the HOA, the threats, and the questionable approval of an easement through my land. This appears to be a coordinated effort to force me to sell my family's historic property below market value, I stated. I've brought copies of the harassment documentation and would like to request a formal investigation into potential ethics violations regarding the approval of developments that directly benefit certain commissioners' associates. Commissioner Walsh's face flushed red, and she began to interrupt, claiming my time was up despite the clock showing I had 30 seconds remaining. Before she could cut my microphone, a woman's voice boomed from the back of the room. "Let him finish, Janet, or have you forgotten that this is still a public meeting?" Heads turned to see my great-aunt Helen, a retired federal judge I hadn't seen in years, standing at the back in her full judicial bearing. Helen had grown up at Pine Ridge before pursuing her law career, and she commanded respect in the community. With a reluctant nod from the commissioner, I finished my statement, officially submitting my documents to the county clerk. After the meeting, a young man approached me, introducing himself as Jake Morrison from the Mountain County Gazette. "That was brave," he said quietly. "I've been wanting to investigate some of these development approvals for months, but I needed someone willing to go on record. I'd like to hear more about this situation." I barely had time to exchange contact information with him before Karen Pemberton intercepted us, her husband hovering behind her with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Quite a performance, Mr. Sullivan," Karen said. "But airing grievances publicly like this is hardly productive. We could have resolved this privately." Richard extended his hand. "Perhaps we should meet to discuss this situation like businessmen. I'm sure we can find a mutually beneficial arrangement." His tone was friendly, but his grip when I shook his hand was crushing. Karen wasn't as subtle. "You're making a serious mistake," she hissed when her husband turned to speak with the commissioner. "Nobody goes against us and comes out ahead. Nobody." 3 days later, Jake's article appeared in the Mountain County Gazette, "Historic Cabin at Center of Controversial Development Plan." The piece detailed my family's long history with the land, the HOA's harassment campaign, and raised questions about the ethics of the county's approval processes. The online version went viral locally, with hundreds of comments supporting Pine Ridge and criticizing the Pemberton tactics. The publicity had an immediate effect. Several Mountain View residents reached out, sharing their own stories of Karen's tyrannical rule over the HOA. One woman, who asked to remain anonymous, explained how Karen had forced her to remove a memorial garden planted for her deceased husband because it used non-approved plants. Others described excessive fines, selective enforcement of rules, and a climate of fear within the community. "Most of us are afraid to speak up," one elderly resident told me. "They control everything from the architectural committee to the landscaping companies allowed in the neighborhood. Cross them, and suddenly your driveway needs emergency repairs or your water gets shut off for maintenance." The article also brought me an unexpected ally. One evening as I was finishing chores, a modest sedan pulled up to my cabin. A young woman in her late 20s stepped out, looking nervously over her shoulder before approaching. "I'm Amy Pemberton," she said. "Karen and Richard's daughter. We need to talk, but not here. Can you meet me tomorrow?" We arranged to meet at a coffee shop 30 miles away in the next county. Amy explained that she worked as an environmental lawyer in Denver but had grown increasingly disturbed by her parents' business practices. "They've done this before," she said, pushing food around her plate. "Buy land cheaply, develop it at maximum density, sell for huge profit, then move on. But they've never encountered resistance like yours. Mom is unstable when she doesn't get her way, and she's getting worse. I've seen her shaking with rage when your name comes up." Amy provided me with internal documents showing that Richard had an arrangement with First Mountain Bank to deny loans to property owners in areas targeted for acquisition. This explained why I'd been rejected for a cabin improvement loan despite excellent credit. "They're desperate to complete Mountain View Grand," Amy confided. "Dad leveraged everything on this development. If it fails, they lose everything." Strange incidents began occurring at the cabin with increasing frequency. One night, all my outdoor furniture mysteriously disappeared, despite being chained to the deck. Another time, I discovered sugar in the gas tank of my generator. The final straw came when I was awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning by Tom pounding on my door, yelling that my tool shed was on fire. We managed to contain the blaze before it spread to the cabin, but the loss was still significant. The fire inspector found clear evidence of arson, accelerant patterns and a broken window. When Deputy Chris Martinez came to take the report, he seemed uncomfortable. Chris and I had grown up together, but his hands were tied. "Off the record, David, I know who's behind this," he said quietly. "But the sheriff plays golf with Richard Pemberton every Sunday, and I've been told to handle complaints about your property with appropriate skepticism. I'll file the report, but don't expect much." I had installed security cameras after the furniture incident, but the system had been mysteriously disabled just before the fire. It was becoming clear that I was fighting not just the Pemberton family, but a network of influence that extended throughout the county's power structure. That night, unable to sleep, I sat on my porch with a shotgun across my lap, scanning the darkness for any movement. The cabin had never felt less like home than it did in that moment, a target under siege rather than a sanctuary. I thought about giving up, about taking whatever offer Richard would make just to end the nightmare. But then I remembered the generations of Sullivans who had held this land through world wars, the Great Depression and countless hardships. If they hadn't given up, how could I? The next morning, I called Marcus with new determination in my voice. "I'm done playing defense," I told him. "It's time to take the fight to them." But I had something the Pembertons didn't know about, something that would change everything. You see, my years as a financial analyst hadn't just taught me about stocks and bonds. I'd specialized in corporate acquisitions and hostile takeovers. I knew how to research financial structures, find weaknesses, and exploit them. While Karen was busy sending me harassment letters, I was quietly investigating the financial foundation of their little empire. What I discovered was beautiful in its simplicity. The Pembertons were massively overleveraged. Richard had borrowed against everything, their house, their other properties, even Karen's jewelry collection, to finance Mountain View Grand. The project was their make-or-break moment, and they were already behind schedule and over budget. Even better, the Mountain View Estates HOA was structured as a separate entity, with its own debts and financial obligations. Karen had been so focused on expanding her power that she'd taken out loans for community improvements that mostly benefited properties connected to Richard's company. The HOA was technically insolvent, kept afloat only by the inflated monthly fees Karen imposed on residents and creative accounting that would make an IRS auditor weep. Working with Marcus, I began the most satisfying research project of my life. We traced shell companies, followed money trails, and documented every questionable transaction. The picture that emerged was of a couple who had built their empire on a foundation of debt, manipulation, and borderline fraud. Then I made my move. Using contacts from my investment firm days, I quietly approached the banks holding the Pembertons' various loans. With Mountain View Grand stalled due to my property dispute and negative publicity mounting, several lenders were getting nervous about their exposure. I made them an offer they couldn't refuse. I would buy their debt at a significant discount, taking the problem off their hands. Within 2 weeks, I owned the mortgages on the Pembertons' mansion, their vacation home in Aspen, and 3 of Richard's commercial properties. I also purchased the HOA's outstanding loans, making me the association's primary creditor. But I wasn't done yet. The next phase required patience and perfect timing. I hired a private investigator to document Karen's activities, building a comprehensive file of her harassment tactics, financial mismanagement of the HOA, and various legal violations. I also reached out to every Mountain View resident who had contacted me after Jake's article, offering to help them document their own experiences with Karen's abuse of power. The breakthrough came when my investigator captured Karen on video illegally dumping construction waste from Richard's other projects onto public forest land near my property. Environmental crimes are taken seriously in Colorado, especially when they threaten water supplies. Armed with this evidence, I made my final move. On a crisp October morning, I called Karen and requested a meeting at the Mountain View clubhouse. I told her I was ready to discuss selling my cabin. She was practically giddy when I arrived, already talking about fair market value, and how reasonable people can always reach an agreement. "I'm so glad you've come to your senses, David," she said, settling into her throne-like chair in the clubhouse's main room. "This unpleasantness has gone on far too long." "You're absolutely right, Karen," I replied, pulling out a folder. "It has gone on too long. That's why I brought some paperwork to finalize everything." Her smile faltered slightly as I handed her the first document. "What's this?" "That's a notice of default on the HOA's loans," I said calmly. "As the primary creditor, I'm calling in the debt. The association has 30 days to pay $1.2 million, or I take possession of all HOA assets, including this clubhouse." Karen's face went white. That's impossible. We don't owe that much." "Actually, you do. When you add up all the loans you took out for improvements, plus interest and penalties for misuse of funds, it comes to exactly that amount. I have documentation of every questionable expenditure, including the $50,000 you spent on landscaping for your personal residence." I handed her the second document. "This is a notice of foreclosure on your house. Richard missed his last 3 mortgage payments, and as the new note holder, I'm exercising my right to accelerate the loan." Karen shot to her feet, her face turning an alarming shade of red. "You can't do this. This is illegal." This is business," I interrupted. "The same kind of business you've been doing to me and everyone else in this community for years. Only difference is I actually followed the law." She grabbed her purse and for a moment I thought she was going to storm out. Instead, she reached inside and pulled out a small silver pistol. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You think you can just waltz in here and destroy everything we've built?" My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. Karen put the gun down. "You're only making this worse for yourself." "No," she screamed. "This cabin will never belong to you. One way or another, your family's legacy ends today." She was pointing the gun directly at my chest, her hand trembling with fury. I could see she was beyond reason, beyond thinking clearly about consequences. "You're standing on Sullivan land, Karen," I said quietly. "We've held it through world wars and depressions. You think you're the first bully we've faced." "I'm not a bully," she shrieked. "I'm protecting our community, our investment, our future." "By threatening to murder someone?" "Karen, listen to yourself." For just a moment, doubt flickered in her eyes. But then her face hardened again. "Nobody will miss one more stubborn mountain man. Accidents happen all the time up here." That's when I played my final card. "Karen," I said, pulling out my phone, "I want you to meet some friends of mine." I pressed a button, and suddenly the clubhouse's large-screen TV flickered to life. On the screen appeared FBI agent Sarah Chin, sitting in what was clearly a federal office. "Good morning, Mrs. Pemberton," Agent Chin said through the screen. "We've been watching this entire conversation through Mr. Sullivan's phone. I strongly advise you to put down the weapon immediately." Karen's mouth fell open. The gun wavered in her grip. "You see, Karen," I continued, "while you were busy harassing me, I was building a federal case against you. Wire fraud, racketeering, environmental crimes, tax evasion. It's quite an impressive list. And now we can add attempted murder to it." Through the open clubhouse doors, I could hear vehicles approaching. Multiple vehicles. "The FBI is here, Karen. It's over." She looked around wildly as if searching for an escape route. "This isn't real. This is some kind of trick." "I'm afraid it's very real," Agent Chin said from the screen. "Mrs. Pemberton, federal agents are entering the building now. For your own safety and that of everyone involved, please put down the weapon and step away from Mr. Sullivan." The clubhouse doors burst open, and agents in tactical gear flooded in, weapons drawn. "Drop the gun. Drop it now." Karen stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, the pistol still pointed at me. I could see the moment when reality finally crashed through her delusions of power and control. The gun clattered to the floor as she collapsed into her chair, sobbing. As the agents cuffed her and read her rights, she looked at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Sullivan. Richard will never let this stand." "Actually, it is over," I replied. "Richard was arrested at your house about 10 minutes ago. Turns out, tax evasion is a federal crime, and the IRS gets really cranky when people hide millions of dollars in offshore accounts. The investigation that followed unraveled the entire Pemberton empire. Years of financial crimes, bribery, environmental violations, and intimidation tactics were exposed. Richard was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Karen got 5 years for her role in the conspiracy, plus the additional charges from threatening me with a gun. Their assets were seized to pay restitution to victims and back taxes. Their mansion, their vacation home, their cars, everything was auctioned off to the highest bidder. As the HOA's new owner, I dissolved the organization entirely, returning governance to the residents themselves. Monthly fees were eliminated, ridiculous restrictions were scrapped, and the community's assets were transferred to a resident-owned cooperative. The people of Mountain View were finally free from Karen's tyranny. Commissioner Walsh resigned in disgrace when her connections to the Pembertons became public. Sheriff Morrison, Richard's golf buddy, was voted out in the next election. Amy Pemberton, who had provided crucial evidence against her parents, inherited nothing but was finally free from their toxic influence. She moved back to Colorado and now works as an environmental advocate, fighting the same kind of corruption her parents had represented. As for Pine Ridge Cabin, it was officially designated a state historical landmark, ensuring its protection for generations to come. Sarah and I grew closer throughout the ordeal, our shared struggle creating a bond that eventually blossomed into love. Her daughter Emma thinks of the cabin as her second home, and she's already learning the family stories that go with the land. Tom officially retired but still visits every day, teaching Emma the same skills he once taught me. Your great-great-grandfather would be proud, he told me one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset over the mountains. Not just of keeping the cabin but of how you did it. Standing up for what's right even when it wasn't easy. The best part? I kept Karen's mansion. Not to live in, it was far too ostentatious for my taste. Instead, I converted it into a community center and museum dedicated to mountain history and environmental education. The plaque by the front door reads, "The Karen Pemberton Center for Community Justice, a reminder that actions have consequences." Every year on the anniversary of Karen pointing that gun at me, the center hosts a festival celebrating community, conservation, and the courage to stand up to bullies. Local kids learn about their history, environmental science, and civic responsibility. Sometimes, justice comes in the form of a federal investigation and criminal convictions. Sometimes it looks like a community center built on the foundation of a bully's former mansion. And sometimes, it's as simple as a family cabin that refuses to be intimidated, no matter how loud the threats become. I still get emails from people around the country facing similar battles with corrupt HOAs or local officials. I tell them all the same thing. Document everything, build community support, and remember that the most powerful weapon against corruption is knowledge. Most importantly, I remind them that bullies count on their victims feeling isolated and powerless. But when you have the truth on your side and the courage to stand up for what's right, even the most arrogant tyrant can find themselves staring at an eviction notice. In the end, Karen Pemberton learned that pointing a gun at someone on their ancestral land isn't just stupid, it's evidence of attempted murder in a federal investigation. And now, every time I drive past the community center that used to be her mansion, I smile and remember that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be intimidated by people who mistake cruelty for power. The mountains are still here. The cabin is still here. And justice, it turns out, has a very long memory.